Life does not always work out the way you expect it to. Take, for example, the story of the man who awoke early in the morning to see his digital clock flashing 3:33. It was 3:33 in the morning. While having breakfast, he realized it was March 3rd, 3-3. Then he thought, I live on 3rd Street in the 3rd house, and as he was reading the paper, he got excited to see that at the horse races that day, there was a horse named Trio running in the 3rd race. Feeling the stars were aligning in his favor, he went to the bank, withdrew his life savings, went to the racetrack, placed all a bet for Trio to win that 3rd race, went to the 3rd section, sat in the 3rd row, watched that race, and you know what Trio did? Placed 3rd. Sometimes life does not work out the way you might expect it to. And I wonder if Abram was getting to that point. In our first reading for today in Genesis chapter 17, he's promised yet again something that God promised him 5 chapters earlier, back in Genesis 12. Over 20 years ago, God promised Abram, I'll give you land, I'll give you descendants. And here we are, 20-some years later, no land, and so far his wife Sarai, no children. Wondering if life is going to work out the way he expected, hearing God's promise. So let's take a look at these first few verses and see what it's like to live a life of faith. The first verse that's before us, when Abram was 99 years old. Now you have to know that Abram's father, Terah, lived to the ripe old age of 205. So by that account, Abram's only in midlife right now. Midlife. The Lord appeared to Abram. That is our desire too, is it not? That God would appear to us, to be made known to us. Somehow we would have a sense of God's presence. 50 years ago, the Russians sent up a cosmonaut into space. Upon coming back, he declared, I have seen the heavens, and there is no God there. And a Russian Orthodox priest responded to that cosmonaut by saying, Dear friend, if you do not see God in the face of your neighbor and the poor, then you will never find God in the heavens. The Lord appeared to Abram. I wonder if the Lord has appeared to you this week in the face of loved ones, friends, neighbors, the poor. He said to him, I am God Almighty. Here we have one of the I am statements that we're going to hear again as God reveals God's self to Moses. I am who I am. And later in the Gospels, Jesus picks up on this I am saying, I am the true vine. You are the branches. I am the bread of life. God says to Abram, I am God Almighty. The Hebrew word there is Shaddai. Many of you might remember Amy Grant making famous the song El Shaddai in the 80s. Shaddai means God Almighty. And Shaddai starts with the Hebrew letter Shin, which is shaped with 3 things, 2 V's and another line coming down. Oh yes, those who know Star Trek realize that I'm making a sign known to Spock and his character. This is a little side trivia note related to our reading. Indeed, those who are fans of Leonard Nimoy would remember that his character Spock had this famous greeting of live long and prosper. There's actually a religious connection to that. In episode 44, when Nimoy's character Spock was supposed to come to his parents' planet and meet again, or see again, his mother, he was told by the producers that when you come before your mother, it's an important moment, and you're going to kneel, and she's going to lay hands on your shoulders, kind of like a knight ceremony. And Nimoy said, but the Vulcans are clairvoyant touchers. That doesn't seem to make sense. And so he suggested an alternate greeting. And Nimoy grew up going to an Orthodox synagogue with his grandfather. And there in the Orthodox synagogue, he would watch the priests in their robes do a service of blessing, and they would use both arms at a 45-degree angle, and they would put their hands in the shape of Shin, the Hebrew letter meaning Shaddai, God Almighty. God Almighty bless you was what he remembered seeing the priests saying. And so he suggested for this episode, rather than the kneeling and the touching, that he would raise his hands and say something, and his mother would respond. And it is history since then. Peace and long life, live long and prosper. Shaddai, God Almighty. Sorry, just had to throw that in, Star Trek lovers. Back to Abram. I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. Walk before me. A careful reading of Genesis. If you were here last week, we talked about Noah and the covenant. And the reason Noah was selected for the covenant was because he was described in Genesis 6:9 as Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. So the author is saying, this is what it means to be in covenant with God. We walk with God, and so too we have that opportunity to be in living relationship with God, to know that God is walking by our side. Isn't that what Jesus called his followers to? Follow me, walk with me, learn from me, live like me. I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, and I will make my covenant between me and you, and will make you exceedingly numerous. And hearing that, Abram, the next verse tells us, Abram fell on his face. Did he trip? No. He fell on his face to worship, to surrender, to express trust. And it's a well-known biblical posture for prayer. We even talked about it in our psalm as we read it. Bow down before the Lord. That's what Abram is doing. He hears this great promise that God has for him. You'll be exceedingly numerous. And he bows down to worship. So too, when we receive God's promises here in this place, in bread and wine, we kneel, we bow down, we worship. And the rest of the text goes on to tell us that the promise is there, the covenant is there. It's going to be an everlasting covenant. He's going to be exceedingly numerous. And then God tells him he's going to change his name from Abram to Abraham. I don't know if you knew that, but that was God's doing, that he would become known as Abraham. And his wife no longer would be known as Sarai, but rather as Sarah. But then comes verse 17, which we didn't read today, which I would like to include, because the text tells us that after receiving this great promise from God, Abram again, this time, falls on his face and laughs. What do we make of that? Well, we know falling on face, we've already learned, that's posture of surrender, of trust, of worship. But the laughter? I saw a sign this week that made me laugh out loud. I was driving south on 352 on my way to Riddle Hospital, and I went past this enormous field, huge athletic complex of fields, all covered in snow and ice still. And as I was driving by, it was the Penn State Brandywine campus, and on their huge marquee and sign there, it said, "This week, March 3rd, first baseball game on our field." And I looked over at their field and I laughed. I wonder if Abraham now, fell on his face and laughed, wondering if God could make good on God's promise. Such an incredulous promise. And as we look around at our world, sometimes we see not incredulous promises, but rather horrendous acts. We look around and we expect the world to be peace and harmony and love, and it becomes one of distress and brokenness and hatred and violence. Last night, while watching the preview of the Philadelphia Flower Show, we were taking note of how the commercials repeat themselves over and over again in the same commercials. And that's how advertising works, right? Repetition. One of them, I like the phrase they used. I think it was for Ashley Furniture. And it shows all these pictures of loving families and friends gathered around dining room tables and in bedrooms and on couches. And at the end it says, dream big. Dream big. I wonder if that's not what the Bible is telling us as well. Did you hear about the Ring of Peace in Oslo last week? Apparently, several weeks ago in Denmark, neighboring country, there was an attack on a synagogue. And so in Oslo last week, as faithful Jews gathered for worship, over 1,000 Muslim believers gathered and joined hands and put arms around shoulders to surround that worship space with a protective ring of humanity. One of the organizers said, "We are here to tell the world there are more peacemongers than warmongers. And we believe there's still hope for humanity, for peace and love across religious differences and backgrounds." And it's important for us to note as we think of Abraham today, to know that in the Quran, Abraham is mentioned 35 times, one in the long line of prophets, starting at Adam and going to Muhammad. Is the world of peace and harmony easy? No, it's a hard road, and we need to continue to pray and act appropriately to respond to evil in the world. But Abraham and Sarah did not have an easy path either, as they lived into God's promise. I like how theologian Frederick Buechner reflects on this laughter of Abraham, and later in Genesis, the same laughter of Sarah, when he says Sarah and her husband had plenty of hard knocks in their time, and there were plenty more still to come. But at the moment when they learned that they had to dip into their old age pensions in order to cash in and build a nursery, the reason they laughed was that it suddenly dawned on them that their wildest dreams they had ever had hadn't been half wild enough. Jesus, too, made promises to his followers, promises of blessings that may have seemed outlandish or cause people to fall forward, wondering if God could deliver on those promises. Remember, he talks about the kingdom being a wedding banquet where all are invited, including the poor and the lame and the crippled, or his signs of healings or feeding so that there was an overabundance. Reveal God's desire and will for the world. Oh no, it doesn't always follow the way we might expect it to happen. We learn that in the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who are persecuted. Coptic Christians and the Assyrian Christians would reflect that witness. Even to a paradise, even to a repentant thief on the cross the day of his death, Jesus promised paradise. Yes, God's blessings are made known in vulnerability and trust. And this is what Abram teaches us. Abraham trusted God. He didn't always get it right, but he relied on God as a game changer, as a name changer. And so too, we in Lent celebrate the same notion. We come to the font and to the table. Sometimes we're a promise keeper, but often we're a promise breaker. Sometimes we walk with God, but other times we stumble and trip and fall down and sometimes even quit altogether. But dear friends, if you but trust and surrender, God is a name changer. For Abram became Abraham, And Sarai is renamed Sarah, and Jacob becomes Israel, and Saul became Paul, and Simon was renamed by Jesus to be Peter. So too God promises in the waters of baptism to give you a new name: child of God, covenant bearer, peacemonger, forgiven sinner, life redeemed, believer, follower, friend, beloved, not forsaken. God, change our names that we might bear yours. Now to him who is able to accomplish abundantly beyond all we could ask or imagine, to him be glory.